Imagine the Roman world at the quiet edge of evening, when the last light settled across tiled roofs in Spain, faded over wheat fields in North Africa, touched marble columns in Greece, and disappeared behind the misty forts of Britain from one horizon to another. Millions of people lived beneath the authority of a single imperial system. Merchants counted coins stamped with the emperor's face. Soldiers watched rivers that marked uncertain frontiers. Farmers carried grain toward local markets. Magistrates copied orders onto wax tablets. Sailors waited for favorable winds. And messengers rode along roads that seemed to bind the known world together, to many who lived within it. Rome appeared less like a state and more like the natural shape of civilization itself. Its cities were crowded with baths, temples, workshops, warehouses, fountains, courts, and arenas. Its laws reached across languages and landscapes. Its armies guarded deserts, mountains, forests, and seas. And its name carried such weight that distant rulers measured their own power against it. Yet the same vastness that made the empire magnificent also created a slow and persistent danger. Every mile added to the frontier required more men, more food, more horses, more money, more roads, more ships and more decisions. Every conquered province brought wealth but also obligations. Every new people placed under Roman rule had to be taxed, defended, governed, and persuaded to remain loyal. Rome became powerful by expanding, but expansion gradually produced a world so large that no single center could fully understand it. No emperor could be present everywhere. No army could protect every threatened border at once. And no treasury could endlessly satisfy all the demands created by imperial greatness. The empire did not suddenly become too large on one particular day. There was no moment when a map was unrolled and a ruler admitted that the boundaries had gone too far. Instead, the problem grew quietly across generations. Hidden beneath victories, ceremonies, monuments, and the confidence of a society accustomed to survival, roads carried legions outward, but they also stretched supply lines thin. Provincial taxes enriched Rome, but they could be interrupted by war. Plague, corruption, or rebellion, local governors represented imperial authority. But distance gave them independence. Frontier generals defended the state, but their armies could also proclaim them emperor. The Roman system had been built through conquest, and conquest rewarded boldness, so stopping was difficult. Even when the practical limits of administration had already appeared, in this long story, the empire's size was never the only reason for its troubles. Climate shifts, disease, political conflict, economic strain, social inequality, migration, civil war, and foreign invasion all mattered, but scale turned each difficulty into something harder to manage. A crisis in one region could demand resources from another. A disputed succession in the capital could expose distant borders. A tax increase meant to support soldiers might weaken farmers. A defensive war in the east might leave the Rhine undermanned. A rebellion in Britain might require months before an emperor even received reliable news. Roman greatness rested on connection, and when those connections slowed, fractured, or became too costly, the empire's enormous body could no longer respond as one. For a sleep documentary, it helps to imagine this not as a single collapse, but as the gradual tiring of a vast machine. A machine made not only of stone roads and marching armies, but of memory, habit, trust, paperwork, tribute, discipline, local cooperation, and the belief that Roman order would continue tomorrow because it had existed yesterday. For centuries, that belief was remarkably strong. Then, little by little, the distances widened, the costs rose, the commands arrived too late, and the empire that had mastered space began to be defeated by the effort required to hold it. Rome had not begun as an empire. It began as a settlement among hills beside the river Tiber, surrounded by communities that were often stronger, older, or richer. Early Romans remembered kings, struggles between social classes, wars with neighbors, and the creation of a republic in which offices were shared among competing aristocratic families. Whether every later legend was accurate mattered less than the identity these stories created. Romans came to believe that endurance, discipline, duty, and military courage had made them exceptional. The republican system encouraged ambitious men to seek honor through public service and war. A successful general gained prestige, wealth, captives, land, and the loyalty of soldiers. A victorious state acquired territory, tribute, strategic security, and new opportunities for further expansion. Conquest therefore became woven into politics, elections, family reputation, and the economy. Rome first defeated rivals in central Italy, then built alliances across the peninsula. These alliances were not simply chains of occupation. They were flexible arrangements that required communities to provide troops while allowing varying degrees of local autonomy. This gave Rome access to an unusually deep reserve of manpower. When one army was destroyed, another could often be raised. When a city rebelled, loyal allies still remained. The Roman Republic learned to absorb losses that might have ended other states. This ability was tested in wars against Carthage, especially during the terrible years when Hannibal crossed the Alps and defeated Roman armies with shocking skill. After the disaster at Cannae, many ancient powers might have negotiated. Rome did not. It rebuilt, recruited, adapted, and continued. The eventual defeat of Carthage gave Rome command of the Western Mediterranean and introduced it to provinces far beyond Italy. Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa brought resources and strategic depth. Victories in Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean followed. Kingdoms that had once shaped regional politics became clients, allies, or possessions. The Republic's success transformed its internal balance. Enormous wealth entered Italy, enslaved labor expanded, aristocrats competed through lavish building and public gifts. Small farmers faced pressure, veterans demanded land, and commanders led armies whose loyalty increasingly attached itself to individuals rather than institutions. The empire grew faster than the Republican Constitution could adapt. Offices designed for the annual government of a city-state now directed territories that took weeks or months to reach. Governors received broad authority because communication with Rome was slow. Tax collection was often contracted to private interests. Provincial communities experienced Roman rule through local elites, military commanders, merchants, creditors, and officials whose behavior varied widely. Some regions prospered under new trade networks and peace. Others suffered exploitation, violence, and repeated demands. Yet expansion continued because the system rewarded it. Generals needed victories, the treasury valued revenue. Allies sought Roman support, and political rivals feared appearing weak. By the 1st century before the Common Era, Roman armies campaigned from Gaul to Syria. While the Republic at home descended into a sequence of political emergencies, reformers were murdered, rival leaders used street violence, generals marched on Rome, and civil wars spread through the provinces. The scale of Roman power had outgrown the habits meant to control it. The wars of Marius and Sulla, then Pompey and Caesar, then the final conflict among Caesar's heirs and enemies, were not simply personal dramas, they revealed a structural problem. Whoever commanded major provincial armies could challenge the center. Distant wealth could finance private ambition, and control of the state increasingly depended on control of soldiers. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul made him too powerful for his rivals to tolerate. His crossing into Italy began another civil war. His victory and dictatorship ended in assassination. But killing one man could not restore an older balance that decades of conquest had already destroyed. After further warfare, Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra, then carefully presented himself not as a king, but as the restorer of peace. He took the name Augustus, held a collection of powers behind republican forms, and created the imperial system that would govern Rome's vast possessions for centuries. The empire survived because Augustus understood that naked conquest could not be the whole purpose of rule. Borders needed armies, provinces needed administration, elites needed status, cities needed order, and the population needed confidence that the civil wars had ended. Yet the settlement he created also depended on resources, loyalty, and communication across an immense territory. It was stable enough to produce a long age of prosperity, but not simple enough to escape the pressures of size. Under Augustus, Rome's dominion stretched across the Mediterranean world, but it was still possible to imagine boundaries that could be watched and defended. The emperor reorganized provinces. Some remained under senatorial administration, while strategically important regions with large armies came under his direct authority. This arrangement reduced the chance that independent governors would control too much military power. Legions became a permanent professional force. Soldiers served long terms, received regular pay, and expected retirement benefits. An imperial treasury helped support them. Veterans were settled in colonies, roads were improved, censuses and tax systems became more orderly, and a network of officials began to give the empire a more consistent shape. Augustus also understood the importance of appearance. He restored temples, sponsored monuments, encouraged traditional morality, and filled public space with messages that connected his family to Rome's destiny. Beneath the ceremonies stood a practical truth. The empire needed cooperation from provincial societies. There were never enough Roman officials to govern every village directly. Instead, local aristocrats collected taxes, maintained order, funded buildings, led councils, and translated imperial expectations into regional practice. In return, they received citizenship, prestige, legal privilege, and access to a wider world. This partnership allowed Rome to rule millions with a surprisingly small central bureaucracy. Greek cities in the east kept many of their traditions. Communities in Gaul adopted Roman law and urban forms at different speeds. Egyptian administration retained ancient habits under new masters, and local religions continued while emperors were honored in public cults. Roman rule was therefore both uniform and varied. Coins, armies, law, and imperial authority created a common frame. But daily life remained deeply local. This flexibility was one reason the empire could become so large. It did not attempt to erase every difference. It recruited local power into the imperial structure. The very success of this model, however, concealed its dependence on trust. When local elites believed Roman rule protected their wealth and status, they supported it. When the state demanded too much, failed to defend them, or became trapped in civil war, cooperation weakened. Augustus also tried to manage expansion with caution. After Roman forces were destroyed in the Teutoburg forest, hopes of controlling much of Germania beyond the Rhine faded. The rivers Rhine and Danube gradually became major frontiers. Not perfect walls, but broad military zones where forts, roads, patrols, diplomacy, trade, and intelligence worked together. In the east, Rome faced the Parthian Empire, a powerful rival that could not easily be conquered. In North Africa, deserts limited movement. In Britain, conquest had not yet begun, and along the Red Sea and Arabian routes, commerce reached beyond imperial borders without requiring direct annexation. These limits suggested a sustainable approach: dominate the Mediterranean, secure key river lines, influence neighboring peoples, and avoid endless campaigns into regions whose cost exceeded their value. But Roman politics never fully abandoned the glory of conquest. Emperors needed military prestige, frontier commanders wanted advancement, and strategic fear encouraged attempts to push danger farther away. A frontier never felt entirely safe when hostile groups lived beyond it. So new forts were built, new client rulers supported, new territories occupied, and each extension created another edge to defend. Augustus had tried to create a stable imperial center, but he left no clear constitutional rule for succession. His position was personal, assembled from titles, family standing, military command, wealth, and public reverence. Later emperors therefore inherited a throne without a simple legal mechanism for choosing its occupant. Adoption, bloodline, senatorial approval, army loyalty, and palace influence all mattered. This ambiguity became more dangerous as the empire expanded, because an emperor's authority depended on distant armies accepting the same ruler. And when they did not, geography turned political uncertainty into civil war for a long time. The system worked with astonishing effectiveness. During the 1st and 2nd centuries, often remembered as the High Empire, Cities flourished across the provinces. Trade moved through the Mediterranean. Legal ideas spread, citizenship expanded, and imperial power reached landscapes that earlier Romans would scarcely have imagined. Claudius began the conquest of Britain. Armies crossed the Channel, established roads and forts, and slowly pushed into regions where resistance continued for decades. In the Balkans and along the Danube, military settlements became centers of commerce. In the east, emperors intervened in Armenia, negotiated with Parthia, and sometimes launched major invasions under Trajan. Roman territory reached its greatest extent. Dacia was conquered north of the Danube, bringing gold and a defensible but demanding province. Arabia Petraea was annexed, strengthening control over trade routes, and Roman armies advanced deep into Mesopotamia, taking cities and reaching the Persian Gulf. Maps of Trajan's reign can make the empire appear complete, a vast belt of power surrounding the Mediterranean and extending into Europe, Africa, and Asia, yet maps do not show the weight of distance. The dryness of roads in summer, the mud of winter tracks, the sickness that spread through camps, the delays caused by storms, the number of pack animals needed to move grain, or the uncertainty faced by a governor waiting for instructions from a ruler hundreds of miles away. Trajan's eastern conquests proved difficult to hold almost immediately. Revolts erupted, supply lines lengthened, and his successor Hadrian abandoned much of the new territory. Hadrian was not simply retreating from ambition. He was recognizing that possession and control were different things. An army could capture a city during a successful campaign, but permanent rule required garrisons, administration, roads, diplomacy, and reliable revenue. Hadrian traveled widely, inspected provinces, reinforced boundaries, and became associated with a more defensive understanding of empire in Britain. The wall bearing his name marked not an absolute border between civilization and wilderness, but a controlled military corridor, with gates, forts, roads, customs activity, and movement on both sides. Elsewhere, natural features were combined with artificial defenses. The Rhine and Danube supported fleets and fort chains. Desert routes in Syria and Africa relied on wells. Outposts and mobile patrols, mountain passes required watchful garrisons. The frontier was not a single line. It was a broad zone of contact, exchange, recruitment, smuggling, marriage, raiding, diplomacy, and cultural mixing. Rome often managed neighboring groups through gifts, trade privileges, hostages, titles, and military service. Force mattered, but so did negotiation. This reduced the need for permanent occupation beyond the border, yet it required careful attention and steady resources. If payments stopped, if a local ally died, if a civil war pulled troops away, or if a neighboring confederation grew stronger, the frontier balance could change quickly. The empire's enormous circumference meant that several regions might become unstable at the same time, a problem that would grow more severe in later centuries. During the prosperous 2nd century, however, Rome still possessed enough wealth, manpower, prestige, and institutional confidence to manage the burden. Emperors such as Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius ruled through established routines. Provincial cities competed to build baths, theaters, arches, and temples. Wealthy citizens funded public works, and the army remained a disciplined foundation of order. But even in this admired age, signs of strain appeared. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his reign fighting along the Danube, where movements of peoples beyond the frontier placed pressure on Roman defenses. An epidemic, often called the Antonine Plague, spread through the empire and likely reduced population, weakened revenue, and harmed military recruitment. The emperor had to sell palace treasures, recruit unusual forces, and remain near the northern wars for years. Rome survived, but the effort revealed how rapidly a distant crisis could consume the attention of the center. The empire was still powerful, yet its safety required constant motion, and the larger it became, the less rest its rulers could afford. To understand why size became such a burden, it is useful to follow a message as it crossed the Roman world. An imperial order might begin in a palace office, where a secretary prepared a document, a seal confirmed authority, and an official courier received instructions. The messenger entered the public post system, changing horses at stations maintained along major roads. Under favorable conditions, he could travel with impressive speed. But favorable conditions were never guaranteed. Rain flooded rivers, snow closed mountain passes, bridges failed. Animals became exhausted, bandits watched lonely stretches. Local officials delayed supplies, and ships remained trapped in harbor when winds turned against them. Ordinary letters moved more slowly than urgent state dispatches, and information from remote villages might first pass through several levels of local administration before reaching a governor, then continue toward the imperial court. An emperor deciding how to answer could be acting on reports already weeks or months old. By the time his response returned, the situation might have changed again. A rebellious commander could gather support, a foreign army could cross a border, or a city could negotiate its own survival before central authority even understood the danger. Modern maps encouraged the eye to cross the Mediterranean in an instant, but ancient rule moved at the pace of feet. Hooves, sails, and human memory. The sea was often faster than land. Yet sailing was seasonal and uncertain. Routes depended on winds rather than fixed schedules. Storms could scatter fleets. Pirates sometimes returned when policing weakened. And winter travel carried serious risk. Rome built one of the finest road systems of the ancient world. But roads did not eliminate distance. They made distance more manageable. A paved military road allowed troops and carts to move with greater reliability. Milestones measured progress, bridges crossed valleys, and stations supported official travel. Still, a legion marching from one frontier to another needed time, food, camp equipment, replacement animals, and coordination with communities along the route. Soldiers could not simply vanish from the Rhine and appear beside the Euphrates. While they were moving, both regions were vulnerable. This created a central strategic problem. Rome possessed formidable armies, but they were distributed around an enormous perimeter. Most legions lived near frontiers because that was where threats were expected. Italy itself contained relatively few troops during stable periods. When danger emerged in one sector, emperors had to decide whether to move units from another, raise new forces, rely on local auxiliaries, negotiate, or accept temporary losses. A false report could waste months. A delayed decision could surrender the initiative, and simultaneous wars could exceed available reserves. The empire attempted to solve this through roads, river fleets, fortified towns, mobile detachments, intelligence networks, and delegated command, but every solution required money and competent leadership. Scale did not make effective government impossible. Rome governed widely for centuries. It made effective government fragile. Because success depended on many separate systems functioning together, a courier needed fresh horses. The station needed tax supplies. The road needed maintenance. The governor needed loyal staff. The local council needed funds. The army needed pay. And the emperor needed reliable advice when several links failed at once. The distances of empire became far more dangerous than they looked during peace. The army was the most visible answer to distance, and also the greatest continuing expense. A Roman legion was not merely a body of fighters, it was an organized community of infantry. Officers, engineers, clerks, medical personnel, craftsmen, servants, families, traders, and animals. Around permanent forts grew settlements where veterans, merchants, and local people exchanged goods and habits. Soldiers built roads, bridges, walls, canals, and public structures. They collected information, enforced decisions, guarded tax movements, and sometimes acted as police. In frontier provinces, the army was often the state in its most immediate form. Its presence encouraged markets and urban growth, but feeding and paying it demanded a vast network of production. Grain came from farms, leather from herds, metal from mines, weapons from workshops, horses from breeding regions, and cash from taxes. Supplies might be gathered locally. transported by river, carried by sea, or drawn from distant provinces. Egypt and North Africa became famous for grain, Spain supplied oil and metals, Gaul produced food, pottery, and textiles. The eastern provinces contributed wealth through dense cities and trade. Yet imperial logistics were not a simple central plan in which every object moved from Rome outward. They were a web of contracts, requisitions, local obligations, private merchants, military officials, and regional routes. This flexibility made the system resilient, but it also opened opportunities for corruption, abuse, delay, and uneven burdens. Communities near military corridors could face heavy demands, while officials exaggerated needs or diverted goods. Soldiers who were paid late might intimidate civilians. Commanders who controlled payrolls gained political influence. The emperor needed the army to defend the empire, but he also needed to defend himself from the army after the death of an emperor. Soldiers might support a candidate who promised a donative, a special cash payment. Each successful military proclamation taught future troops that loyalty could be negotiated, and each civil war forced rulers to reward the forces that secured victory. Military pay rose over time, benefits expanded, and the cost of political survival became tied to the cost of frontier defense. A ruler who economized risked mutiny, a ruler who spent freely risked inflation and heavier taxation. This tension grew because the army's size could not easily be reduced. Frontiers still needed guards, rebellious provinces still required force, and neighboring powers watched for weakness. The empire had created obligations that continued even when revenue declined. During prosperity, taxes, mines, customs, estates, and tribute could support these demands. During epidemic or war, fewer farmers produced less, trade contracted. Abandoned land yielded no revenue, and emergency levies deepened hardship. The state then faced an uncomfortable choice: collect more from a weakened population, debase coinage, confiscate supplies, or leave soldiers unpaid. None of these solutions restored long-term balance. Each transferred pressure elsewhere. The Roman army remained capable of remarkable victories even in difficult centuries, and it should not be imagined as a force that simply decayed. It adapted, recruited new peoples, changed equipment, reorganized units, and developed mobile field armies, but adaptation itself carried costs. More cavalry meant more horses and fodder. Deeper fortifications meant more construction. Divided commands meant more officers. And multiple imperial courts meant multiple establishments. The larger strategic environment demanded more flexibility precisely when the economic foundation became less predictable. Beneath armies and emperors stood the provincial cities, villages, estates, and households that made imperial rule possible. Rome's administrative achievement was impressive, partly because its central government was small by later standards. It did not employ a modern bureaucracy reaching directly into every street. Instead, it relied on layers of cooperation. City councils registered property, organized local taxes, maintained roads and public buildings, supervised markets, sponsored festivals, and communicated with governors. Wealthy families competed for office and honor, paying for games, baths, temples, fountains, and food distributions. Their generosity was not purely charitable. It demonstrated status and secured influence, but it also reduced the state's need to fund urban life directly. Provincial elites educated their sons in Roman law and rhetoric, adopted Roman names, sought citizenship, served in the army or administration, and sometimes entered the Senate. This gradual integration turned former subjects into partners. An aristocrat in Gaul, Africa, or Syria could see imperial stability as the foundation of his own position. The empire's breadth then became an advantage. Careers, trade, education, and patronage crossed provincial boundaries. Legal appeals could reach higher authorities. Citizenship provided identity beyond a local town, and peace protected accumulated wealth. However, the system worked best when municipal office remained desirable. In later periods, tax obligations attached to local councils became increasingly burdensome. Councillors could be held responsible for collecting quotas even when harvests failed or taxpayers disappeared. Wealthy people tried to avoid service through exemptions, imperial careers, religious offices, or movement to estates. The state responded by making duties more compulsory, which preserved revenue in the immediate term but weakened voluntary civic participation. A structure once supported by competition and pride became associated with obligation and risk. This did not happen everywhere at the same time. Prosperous eastern cities continued to display energy, and many western communities remained active, yet the direction mattered. As central demands increased, local flexibility narrowed. Large landowners gained protection through connections, smaller farmers faced debt or dependence. Some placed themselves under powerful patrons to escape officials or insecurity, reducing the state's direct access to taxpayers. Imperial laws repeatedly complained about evasion, corruption, abandoned land, and officials who burdened the weak while sparing the influential. The repetition of such laws does not prove that every order failed, but it shows how difficult enforcement became across great distances. An emperor could command fairness, a governor could issue a proclamation, yet the actual encounter between state and subject happened in a village, office, field, or roadside station where local power mattered more than distant principle. Size multiplied these points of negotiation. No central government could inspect them all. So Rome depended on reputation and routine. People paid because others paid, obeyed because authority appeared continuous, and accepted officials because resistance seemed costly. When civil wars produced rival emperors, that certainty weakened. Communities waited to see who would win. Governors changed allegiance, taxes were claimed by competing armies, and local leaders protected themselves through whichever arrangement seemed safest. The empire's great scale then created not unity, but overlapping loyalties. Each province had its own immediate fears, and the interests of the whole were difficult to preserve when the center itself was divided. The economy connecting this world was broad, active, and regionally diverse. Ships carried grain, wine, oil, fish sauce, marble, timber, ceramics, glass, metals, textiles, spices, and luxury goods. Merchants used standardized coinage and legal forms. Ports linked inland roads to sea routes. Warehouses stored harvests, and cities created reliable demand. Roman peace reduced some risks and opened markets across political boundaries that had once been fragmented. Archaeological finds reveal goods moving astonishing distances. Spanish oil jars reached military sites in northern Europe. African pottery appeared around the Mediterranean. Eastern spices reached elite tables, and Egyptian grain helped feed Rome. But the existence of long-distance trade should not suggest that every village depended on international exchange. Most people lived close to the land, consumed much of what their region produced, and experienced the empire through taxes, military recruitment, law, and occasional market opportunities. The state drew surplus from this overwhelmingly agricultural base, which meant that weather, disease, soil exhaustion, war, and labor conditions could alter revenue sharply. Agricultural technology improved in some places. Irrigation supported rich zones and estates specialized for markets. Yet productivity could not expand without limit. The empire's spending needs, especially military needs, tended to remain or rise even when harvests weakened. Coinage helped bridge these demands. Emperors minted gold, silver, and bronze currencies, paid troops, purchased supplies, and communicated legitimacy through portraits and titles. During fiscal strain, however, the precious metal content of coins could be reduced. More pieces could be produced from the same supply, allowing immediate payments but weakening confidence and contributing to rising prices. Debasement was not always crude fraud. It was a response to real pressure. The state needed liquidity in a world where tax collection was slow and uneven. But repeated reductions created instability. People preferred older or more reliable coins. Prices shifted, officials demanded payment in kind, and economic calculation became harder. The 3rd century would show this dramatically, yet even earlier. The dependence of the imperial economy on political order was clear. Trade flourished when seas were safe, roads maintained, contracts respected, and currencies trusted, civil war disrupted all four. Armies seized transport. Rival rulers minted competing money. Towns were besieged. Merchants avoided dangerous routes, and farmers concealed produce from requisition. The empire's size once spread risk. A poor harvest in one region could be balanced by supplies from another, but only if transport and authority remained intact. When multiple regions suffered at once, the same size magnified the challenge. Food existed somewhere, soldiers needed it elsewhere. Ships and carts had to connect the two, officials had to organize movement, and communities had to believe that surrendering supplies would not leave them defenseless or starving. Imperial power was therefore less a pile of wealth than an ability to move resources across space. When that ability faltered, prosperous provinces could no longer easily rescue threatened ones, and distant frontiers began to live from their own shrinking surroundings. The reign of Marcus Aurelius ended in 180, and although no single date divides Roman strength from Roman decline, the generations that followed exposed weaknesses that had long been contained. His son Commodus inherited the throne through blood rather than adoption, and his rule became associated with court intrigue, strained relations with the Senate, theatrical self-presentation, and political violence. After his assassination, rival claimants competed for power, beginning another civil war. Septimius Severus eventually prevailed because he controlled loyal armies, and his victory made an enduring lesson unmistakable. Emperors were chosen in theory by a blend of inheritance, law, senate, and public recognition. But in moments of crisis, the decisive voice belonged to armed men. Severus strengthened the military, raised pay, allowed soldiers greater domestic stability, and founded a dynasty. These measures secured immediate loyalty, yet they also increased expenditure and encouraged future rulers to treat the army as the first audience of imperial government. Advice attributed to Severus urged his sons to enrich the soldiers and disregard everyone else. Whether or not the phrase was spoken exactly that way, it captures the political reality of the age. The empire could survive an unpopular emperor more easily than an emperor abandoned by his troops. Caracalla, one of Severus's sons, extended Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, a remarkable legal transformation that completed centuries of integration. But it may also have broadened access to certain taxes and reinforced the fiscal needs of the state. Citizenship had once been a prized privilege, gradually awarded to allies and provincial elites. Now, it became a nearly universal status, symbolically uniting the empire at the same moment when political unity was becoming harder to maintain. Rulers rose and fell, campaigns in the east consumed resources, court officials competed, and military factions learned that the imperial office could be seized, sold, or bestowed. Yet the true storm arrived in the 3rd century, when political instability, external pressure, epidemic disease, and economic disruption converged across a territory too large for any one response. After the assassination of Alexander Severus in 235, the empire entered a period often called the crisis of the 3rd century. For roughly 5 decades, emperors appeared with bewildering speed. Some ruled for years, others for months. Many died violently. Frontier armies proclaimed their own commanders. Senatorial candidates struggled for legitimacy. Palace conspiracies removed rulers, and civil war became nearly continuous. It is easy to turn this history into a list of names. But for ordinary people, the more important fact was uncertainty. A city might receive a new emperor's coinage before learning that he had already been defeated. Taxes might be demanded for one campaign and then demanded again by its rival. Soldiers passed through fields, requisitioned grain, occupied homes, and carried rumors. Governors watched the loyalties of their troops. Local councils tried to predict which authority would survive, and merchants faced roads where official protection could no longer be assumed. The empire's size allowed usurpers to establish regional bases. A commander on the Rhine or Danube controlled experienced armies far from Rome. An eastern governor might command wealthy provinces and strategic cities, A ruler in Egypt could influence the grain supply, and months of travel separated these centers from one another. In a compact kingdom, rebellion might be confronted before it gathered momentum. In the Roman world, distance gave ambition time. By the time the recognized emperor marched toward one challenger, another frontier might break when armies were moved to fight Romans. Foreign groups found openings, civil war and invasion therefore reinforced each other. Each usurpation demanded troops from the borders. Each weakened border damaged the emperor's reputation, and each defeat encouraged new rivals to claim that only they could restore security. The imperial system had no accepted method for replacing a failed ruler peacefully, so political correction occurred through assassination or battle. This was one of the clearest ways in which scale became fatal. The empire required several strong commanders, but any strong commander with troops could become a threat to the emperor. Central authority needed delegated power and feared it at the same time. Beyond the Rhine and Danube, societies were changing. Roman writers used broad labels for many peoples, often describing them as Germans, Goths, Sarmatians, or other collective names, but these were not fixed nations moving as single blocks. They were shifting coalitions, families, warbands, villages, client groups, refugees, traders, and ambitious leaders whose identities could expand or change. Centuries of contact with Rome altered frontier politics. Trade brought goods and wealth, military service provided training, subsidies rewarded favored rulers, and Roman interventions sometimes helped larger confederations form. The empire's frontier policy had often divided neighboring groups and balanced them against one another. But stronger coalitions could now assemble forces capable of deeper raids. Across the eastern frontier, the Parthian monarchy was replaced by the Sasanian Persian Empire, a more centralized and assertive power that claimed ancient royal traditions and challenged Rome for control of Mesopotamia. Armenia and the routes between them, Rome therefore faced major pressure in both Europe and the East. While internal wars consumed its best troops, the Emperor Valerian marched against Persia and was captured by the Sasanian king Shapur. An extraordinary humiliation. Roman emperors presented themselves as invincible guardians of order, yet one now lived as a prisoner of the enemy. The psychological damage mattered as much as the military loss. If the emperor could be captured, provincial leaders could no longer assume that the center would save them. They began to organize defense on their own in the West. A breakaway realm, sometimes called the Gallic Empire, formed around Gaul, Britain and parts of Spain in the east. Palmyra under Odenathus and later Queen Zenobia developed into a regional power that defended territory against Persia and then asserted greater independence from Rome. These states were not simply foreign conquerors carving up a corpse. They emerged from Roman provincial structures and used Roman titles, armies, cities, and political language. Their existence showed that regional government could function when central government failed, but it also revealed the empire's tendency to divide along practical lines. Western armies addressed Western threats, Eastern cities funded Eastern defense, and the idea of a single ruler became less important than the immediate need for protection. The Roman world was not yet ending, but it was discovering that its parts could survive separately. A discovery that would later shape permanent division disease deepened the crisis. An epidemic, commonly called the Plague of Cyprian, spread during the middle decades of the 3rd century. Ancient descriptions are difficult to diagnose with certainty, but they speak of severe illness, death, fear, and social disruption. Epidemics harmed ancient states in many connected ways. They removed farmers during planting and harvest, reduced the number of taxpayers, weakened military recruitment, killed officials and craftsmen, disrupted families, raised labor costs, and encouraged religious anxiety. The Roman state had no germ theory, no modern public health administration, and limited ability to coordinate relief across continents. Communities responded through local care, ritual, flight, burial, charity, and sometimes blame. Christian groups gained attention in some cities for caring for the sick, While imperial authorities at other moments treated religious nonconformity as a threat to unity, disease did not respect frontiers or political allegiance. Armies and trade routes that connected the empire also carried infection. The same infrastructure that made Rome powerful made contagion mobile. In a smaller region, losses might remain local. In the integrated Roman world, epidemic waves could reach distant provinces and return. Exact population figures remain uncertain. Yet even moderate reductions would have been serious because military and fiscal commitments did not shrink automatically. A fort still needed defenders, a road still needed repairs, an emperor still needed legitimacy, and cities still expected grain. Fewer healthy workers had to carry similar burdens. The state responded with stronger collection, forced service, recruitment from new groups, and changes in money. Each response solved one problem while creating another. Tax pressure encouraged evasion, compulsory labor discouraged civic responsibility, frontier recruitment altered military loyalties, and debased coinage weakened exchange. None of these outcomes was inevitable on its own, but together they reduced the flexibility that a vast empire needed. Most inflation and monetary disorder became visible signs of deeper imbalance. Silver coins contained less and less silver, their surfaces could still shine. But their internal value declined, prices rose unevenly, older currency disappeared into hoards, military payments expanded, and regional economies relied increasingly on barter, payment in kind, or more trusted forms of money. The state's difficulty was not simply greed or incompetence. Rulers inherited armies that had to be paid immediately, while tax revenues arrived slowly and might already have been seized by rivals. Minting more coin allowed action now, even if it reduced stability later. Civil war shortened political horizons. An emperor uncertain of surviving the year had little reason to protect a currency whose consequences would be felt over decades. Soldiers demanded reward, urban populations expected supply, frontier commanders needed equipment, and every rival promised restoration. So the monetary system absorbed the cost of political insecurity. Economic disruption varied by region. Some farms and cities continued to prosper, local trade survived, and archaeological evidence warns against imagining universal ruin. Nevertheless, the empire's capacity to transfer wealth reliably declined, and this mattered more than whether every province became poor. A strong region could no longer be taxed and connected with the same efficiency. Transport became dangerous, official requisitions distorted markets, and communities protected resources locally. Imperial scale depended on circulation. When coins, grain, people, and information stopped moving freely, the territory remained large on maps while becoming smaller in practice. The crisis also changed the physical and emotional landscape of Roman life. Cities that had once built open monuments and decorative gates began strengthening walls. Even places far from old frontiers prepared for attack. Statues and inscriptions honored soldiers and local defenders. Rural villas were abandoned in some regions while fortified settlements became more important. Travelers faced checkpoints, changing authorities and armed escorts. People hid coins in the ground and sometimes never returned to recover them. Temples received prayers for safety, new religious movements offered meaning, and imperial ceremonies became more elaborate as rulers tried to display a stability that ordinary experience denied. The emperor's image appeared with radiant crowns, military titles, and claims of divine favor. But authority could not be created through imagery alone. It had to arrive in the form of paid troops, protected roads, fair courts, predictable taxes, and victory. Where those things disappeared, local power filled the space. Landowners protected dependents, bishops organized charity, military officers negotiated with neighboring groups, and cities bargained for survival. The later Roman world would rely increasingly on these intermediaries, not because the central state vanished, but because it could not act directly across every part of its territory. Size forced delegation, crisis made delegation permanent, and permanent delegation weakened the idea that all effective power flowed from one center. The empire nevertheless recovered. and this recovery is essential to understanding its resilience. Emperors such as Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian Probus, and their commanders defeated invading forces, restored frontiers, reunified breakaway regions, and reasserted imperial authority. Aurelian abandoned Dacia north of the Danube, shortening a difficult frontier, defeated Palmyra, ended the Gallic separation, and surrounded Rome itself with massive walls. His victories earned him the title Restorer of the World. The phrase captured both pride and exhaustion. The world had been restored because it had nearly broken apart. Abandonment of Dacia showed a new realism. Territory could be sacrificed to preserve a stronger line. Yet even successful retrenchment carried human consequences. Soldiers, officials, and civilians moved south. Identities and claims had to be reorganized, and the loss admitted that expansion could reverse. Aurelian's walls around Rome revealed another transformation. The capital that had once stood secure behind distant frontiers now expected danger close to home. Later emperors completed the military and administrative rebuilding, but they did not return to the lighter government of Augustus. The crisis had demonstrated that the empire was too large for one court, too exposed for a thinly spread army, and too fiscally demanding for informal administration. The solution would be more emperors, more provinces, more officials, more taxes, more controlled occupations, and a more visibly authoritarian state. Rome survived the 3rd century by becoming different, stronger in organization, heavier in burden, and increasingly divided into regions that could be governed at closer range. When Diocletian became emperor in 284, he inherited a state that had proved both durable and nearly ungovernable. He was a soldier from the Balkans, shaped by the frontier world that had supplied many of the empire's most capable later rulers, and he understood that ceremonial restoration alone would not solve the problem of distance. No emperor, however energetic, could inspect Britain, fight on the Danube, negotiate in Egypt, and answer Persia within the time demanded by events. Diocletian therefore developed a system later known as the Tetrarchy. Ruled by 4, he appointed Maximian as a fellow senior emperor, then added 2 junior emperors, Constantius and Galerius. Each ruler received responsibility for a particular region. Courts moved closer to threatened frontiers. An imperial presence became distributed across the map. Milan, Trier, Sirmium, Nicomedia, Antioch, and other strategic centers gained importance. While Rome remained symbolically sacred but less central to daily command, this arrangement was a direct response to excessive scale. Instead of forcing all decisions through one capital, the empire created several centers capable of acting quickly. A ruler near the Rhine could address Western threats, one near the Danube could supervise Balkan armies, and one in the east could confront Persia. Official ideology insisted that the emperors formed a harmonious college. Portraits made them appear nearly identical, united in purpose rather than divided by personal ambition. Succession was supposed to occur through orderly promotion. Junior rulers would become senior rulers and appoint replacements. For a time, the system brought stability. Campaigns succeeded, revolts were suppressed, frontiers strengthened, and government became more responsive. But the Tetrarchy also multiplied courts, armies, palaces, officials, and ceremonial expenses. What Rome gained in regional speed it paid for in administrative weight, and harmony depended on exceptional cooperation among powerful men. Once Diocletian and Maximian retired, rival claims, blood relationships, military loyalties, and personal ambition reopened civil war. The Tetrarchy solved the geography of command more effectively than it solved the politics of succession. Diocletian's reforms reached deep into provincial administration. Large provinces were divided into smaller units so governors would control fewer resources and pose less danger as rebels. Groups of provinces were organized under higher officials. Military command was increasingly separated from civilian authority, and layers of supervision expanded. These changes improved oversight, shortened some lines of responsibility, and made tax collection more systematic. But they also created a denser bureaucracy supported by the same productive population. More officials meant more salaries, transport, offices, records, exemptions, and opportunities for corruption, the state tried to measure its resources through censuses and assessments that connected land, labor, crops, and expected taxation. Taxes were often demanded in kind because unstable coinage could not reliably supply armies. Grain, animals, cloth, weapons, and transport obligations flowed toward military needs. Officials sought predictable quotas, yet agriculture was never fully predictable. Harvests varied, families changed, villages lost workers, and local conditions resisted neat calculation. A quota designed at one moment could become crushing after drought, invasion, or epidemic. Collectors were still expected to deliver, so pressure moved downward toward those least able to avoid it. Imperial law attempted to prevent taxpayers from fleeing, workers from abandoning essential trades, and councillors from escaping civic duties. Occupations became increasingly hereditary in principle. Sons of soldiers, bakers, shippers, and tax officials could be tied to their fathers' roles. Enforcement was uneven, and people continued to move or negotiate exemptions. But the direction revealed the state's fear. Rome worried not only about foreign enemies, but about the disappearance of the social categories on which its enormous system depended. When free choice threatened revenue and supply, law tried to turn service into obligation. The famous edict on maximum prices belonged to this same effort to impose order. Diocletian's government listed limits for the prices of many goods, wages, and services, condemning profiteering and presenting inflation as a moral offense against society. The document gives a fascinating glimpse of the empire's economic range, from food and clothing to transport and skilled labor. Yet price controls could not reverse the causes of scarcity. Monetary instability, military demand, regional difference, and disrupted trade. A legal price suitable in one province might be unrealistic in another. Sellers could withdraw goods, officials might enforce rules selectively, and black markets could appear. The edict seems not to have achieved lasting success, but its ambition is revealing. The imperial state now imagined that it must regulate an economy stretching across continents in order to preserve military and social stability. The larger the empire, the more impossible uniform rules became. Yet the more crisis encouraged rulers to issue them. Diocletian also reformed coinage and taxation, built fortifications, enlarged armies, and emphasized the sacred majesty of the emperor. Subjects approached through elaborate ceremony. Titles and court ritual created distance between ruler and ordinary petitioner. This was not merely vanity. Majesty protected an office that had been treated as a prize for mutinous soldiers by surrounding the emperor with divine favor and strict hierarchy. The government tried to make rebellion feel like sacrilege, however. Ceremonial authority could not erase the fact that emperors still depended on armies, and the persecution of Christians late in Diocletian's reign showed the limits of enforced unity. Officials ordered churches destroyed, scriptures surrendered, and sacrifices performed. But implementation varied, resistance continued, and within a generation, the imperial relationship with Christianity changed completely. Constantine emerged from the civil wars that followed the Tetrarchy, defeating rivals and gradually reuniting the empire under his sole rule. His victory at the Milvian Bridge became connected with Christian divine support, and the agreement commonly associated with Milan granted toleration to Christians. Constantine favored the church, funded buildings, involved himself in disputes, summoned bishops to the Council of Nicaea, and placed Christianity within imperial politics. Although traditional worship continued and the religious transformation unfolded over many decades, this alliance changed the social structure of the empire. Bishops became influential urban leaders. Churches acquired property, charitable networks expanded, and religious debates crossed provincial boundaries with remarkable intensity. Christianity offered a universal community that matched the scale of Roman rule. Letters, councils, pilgrimage, doctrine, and hierarchy linked believers across languages and regions. The church benefited from Roman roads, cities, law, and communication. even as it developed an authority not identical to the state. Later, when Western imperial institutions weakened, bishops would remain as local organizers, negotiators, judges, and guardians of civic memory. This did not cause the empire's collapse. As older arguments sometimes claimed, Christian emperors continued to fight, tax, legislate, and defend territory, and the Eastern Roman Empire would remain Christian and powerful for centuries, but religious change did redirect wealth. Identity and public competition, temples lost support in some places, churches became new centers of patronage, and disputes over belief could intensify political divisions. Emperors now sought unity not only in law and loyalty, but in doctrine across an empire of immense cultural variety. That goal produced councils, compromises, exiles, rival bishops, and recurring controversy. Constantine founded a new imperial capital at Byzantium. Renamed Constantinople, positioned beside the Bosporus where Europe and Asia nearly meet, the location was strategically brilliant, protected by water, close to the Danube and eastern frontiers, connected to Black Sea grain routes and Mediterranean commerce, and distant from the entrenched aristocratic politics of old Rome. Massive walls, palaces, churches, forums, and public buildings turned it into a center worthy of imperial rule. The founding also made visible a shift that had been developing for generations. The richest, most urbanized and strategically important parts of the empire increasingly lay in the east. Egypt supplied grain, Syria and Asia Minor contained prosperous cities, eastern trade routes brought revenue, and the frontier with Persia demanded constant imperial attention. The West remained extensive and valuable, with Africa, Italy, Gaul, Spain, and Britain, but its cities were generally less dense. Some regions were more exposed to Rhine and Danube pressures, and long land frontiers required costly defense. Constantinople could coordinate the eastern half more effectively than Rome, yet its success also encouraged a political gravity that the West could not easily match. Imperial courts had long moved, and Rome had already lost practical centrality, but the new capital provided the East with a durable, fortified heart. The Western government would later move among Milan, Trier, Ravenna, and other centers without developing an equivalent combination of location, wealth, defense, and continuity. Constantine also reshaped the army and currency. Gold coinage, known as the solidars, became a stable foundation for high-value payments and would endure for centuries, while lower levels of exchange remained more troubled. Mobile field armies accompanied emperors or regional commanders, and frontier troops guarded fixed zones. This combination allowed rapid response without entirely stripping borders. Yet field armies were useful in civil war as well as defense, and competition among commanders remained dangerous. Military recruitment drew increasingly from populations beyond older Roman identities. Germans, Goths, Armenians, Arabs, and many others served as individuals or units. Some rose to high command. This was not unprecedented. Rome had always incorporated outsiders, granted citizenship, and turned former enemies into soldiers. Inclusion was one of its greatest strengths. The problem emerged when the state lacked the money, authority, or administrative control to integrate large groups on favorable terms. Recruitment that strengthened the army during stable government could produce semi-independent power during political fracture. The categories Roman and barbarian were never as simple as later storytelling suggests. A frontier warrior might serve Rome for decades, speak Latin, marry locally, receive land, and defend the empire against people described by the same broad ethnic label. A Roman general might have a non-Roman father, while an invader might seek an imperial title rather than the destruction of the empire. The later Western collapse would be shaped by these mixed loyalties, not by a clean struggle between civilization and an entirely separate outside world. After Constantine's death, his sons divided authority and fought one another, demonstrating again that territorial division was practical. While dynastic unity was unstable, the 4th century saw capable emperors, military successes, legal development, economic activity, and cultural creativity. It was not a simple corridor toward ruin. Cities in the east thrived. African agriculture remained productive. Aristocratic wealth could be immense, and imperial administration reached deeply into society. Yet the system demanded constant balance. Persia remained a sophisticated rival. Frontier coalitions shifted. Religious controversy divided courts and communities, and every succession risked conflict. The Emperor Julian launched a great Persian campaign that advanced dramatically, but ended with his death and a difficult retreat. Territory had to be surrendered, and the episode repeated an old imperial lesson. Offensive glory in Mesopotamia could become a logistical trap. Armies operating far from secure supplies were vulnerable even after battlefield success. Later emperors often ruled with colleagues, brothers, sons, or appointed partners, because one ruler could not supervise the whole. This collegial model worked when relationships held, but courts developed separate interests, officials defended regional priorities, and armies expected rulers to remain near them. The empire was still legally one, yet administration increasingly recognized eastern and western halves as distinct theaters. The difference between those halves was not merely a line on a map. The east possessed more numerous cities, stronger tax bases, established bureaucratic traditions, and geographic defenses that could be concentrated around key routes. Asia Minor formed a broad, protected interior. Egypt could be reached mainly through narrow approaches. Constantinople controlled a strategic crossing and was surrounded by formidable walls. Eastern diplomacy also had long experience managing Persia, Armenia, Arab clients, and Black Sea peoples. The West had advantages of its own, including African grain, Italian prestige, Gallic resources, and seasoned frontier armies, but it faced a very long arc of exposure, from Britain through the Rhine to the upper Danube. With Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts requiring security, moving an army from Italy to northern Gaul consumed time. Defending Britain meant crossing sea lanes. Supporting frontier forces required taxes from regions sometimes distant from the fighting. And when Africa was later lost, the Western government would lose one of its most dependable revenue sources. Scale therefore affected the two halves differently. The East could contract around a wealthy, defensible core. The West contained broad territories but lacked a single protected center capable of directing them all. When crises arrived, Western rulers often sacrificed one region to save another, withdrew from Britain to defend Gaul or Italy, left stretches of frontier to local forces, or granted land and authority to allied groups because direct administration had become impossible. Social inequality also shaped the empire's ability to bear its size. Senators and great landowners possessed estates in several provinces, urban homes, rural villas, political connections, and legal privileges. They could shelter dependents, negotiate taxes, secure exemptions, and sometimes maintain private armed followings. At the other end of society, tenant farmers, laborers, enslaved people, smallholders, artisans, and the urban poor carried burdens with fewer protections. Late Roman laws drew rural tenants more tightly to estates, contributing to forms of dependency that differed from slavery but limited movement. Powerful landlords could seem more immediate than imperial officials, especially where roads were unsafe or courts corrupt. A peasant might care less about which emperor ruled than about rent, harvest, conscription, and the arrival of tax collectors. This distance between imperial ideology and local experience weakened the willingness to sacrifice for the whole. Rome had never been socially equal, but during expansion, conquest and growth could create opportunities. Later, when territory no longer produced easy new wealth, the state extracted more from existing communities. Elites guarded privilege, and the burden became uneven. An empire of enormous estates and struggling taxpayers could appear rich while lacking accessible revenue. Wealth existed, but much of it was protected, localized, or invested in land rather than available for frontier defense. Emperors issued laws against tax evasion and aristocratic abuse. Yet enforcement depended on the same influential class whose cooperation government required. The late Roman state was therefore not weak in a simple sense. It could mobilize armies, construct walls, issue detailed laws, convene church councils, reform money, move capitals, and survive severe defeats, its power was greater and more intrusive than that of the early empire in many respects. But it was also less forgiving. More people were tied to obligations, more resources were earmarked for defense, and more officials stood between producer and ruler. The system resembled a great ship, strengthened with heavier beams after surviving repeated storms. The reinforcement kept it afloat, yet added weight and reduced flexibility. Each new court protected a region but required funding. Each smaller province improved supervision but increased administration. Each mobile army answered invasion but tempted political ambition. Each tax reform clarified obligations but hardened them against local change. The empire was adapting intelligently to its size, while discovering that every adaptation created a new cost. By the late 4th century, the question was no longer whether Rome could rule the entire Mediterranean world exactly as Augustus had ruled it. That model was gone. The question was whether a divided, fortified, Christian, bureaucratic, militarized empire could maintain enough unity to survive the pressures gathering beyond and within its frontiers. The pressure that tested this late imperial structure most severely began not with a single invasion, but with movement across a frontier already shaped by centuries of contact. During the later 4th century, the Huns appeared north of the Black Sea. Their arrival disrupted existing balances among Gothic and other communities. Groups fled, alliances broke, leaders searched for safety, and large numbers of Goths approached the Danube, asking permission to enter Roman territory. They were not merely an invading army. They included families, dependents, warriors, and people carrying what possessions they could save. Roman authorities faced a familiar choice on an unfamiliar scale. Newcomers could become soldiers, farmers, and taxpayers, strengthening underpopulated regions. But they also needed food, land, supervision, and trustworthy agreements. The Emperor Valens allowed many to cross, yet local officials mishandled the settlement. Supplies were inadequate, corruption flourished, desperate people were exploited, and anger turned into rebellion. The crisis shows how the empire's size depended on competent administration at its edges. A decision made at the highest level could fail through abuse in a frontier province. And once tens of thousands of armed and hungry people moved beyond control, distant orders could not repair the damage quickly. Roman forces struggled to contain them. And in 378, near Adrianople, Valens attacked before Western reinforcements arrived. The battle ended in disaster. Much of the Eastern Field Army was destroyed, and the emperor was killed. Adrianople did not instantly destroy Roman power. Later armies recovered, and the Eastern Empire remained formidable. But the defeat altered the terms of settlement. The Goths could not easily be expelled, so Theodosius I negotiated an agreement allowing them to live within the empire under their own leaders while providing military service. The exact terms remained debated, yet the broader pattern became important. Large groups were settled collectively rather than dispersed and absorbed in older ways. They retained stronger internal organization, and Roman commanders relied increasingly on federate troops led by their own chiefs. This could be practical. The state needed soldiers. The settlers needed land and legitimacy, and cooperation could defend the frontier. But it also created armed communities whose loyalty depended on negotiation, pay, status, and successful leadership. When imperial promises failed, they had the capacity to act independently again. The problem was not that outsiders could never become Roman. The empire had been built through incorporation. The danger came when incorporation occurred under emergency conditions in a state divided by rival courts and short of resources. Theodosius became the last emperor to rule both eastern and western halves under his sole authority. After his death in 395, government passed to his young sons Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. Officials, generals, court factions, and military leaders acted around them, and the administrative division hardened in legal theory. The empire remained a shared Roman world, Laws could speak in the names of both emperors. Dynastic ties continued and armies sometimes cooperated, but each court protected its own survival. Eastern ministers preferred to direct dangerous groups westward rather than weaken their own defences. Western officials guarded Italy and Gaul even when Britain or Spain suffered. The size of the old empire no longer created a common reservoir automatically. It created competing priorities. The East had resources the West needed. But Eastern rulers were not always willing or able to spend them on distant Western frontiers. The West possessed generals who could defend it, but those generals could threaten weak emperors. Stilicho, a powerful commander serving Honorius, fought rivals and invading groups while trying to balance the interests of both halves. His mixed background, Roman office, military authority, and connections with Federate soldiers embodied the complexity of the age, yet court suspicion led to his execution, after which many soldiers and their families who had depended on his protection turned toward Alaric. The Gothic leader, who had repeatedly bargained with Roman governments for command, payment, land, and recognition. Alaric did not begin with a simple plan to erase Rome. He had served within imperial politics and sought a secure place for his followers. But negotiations failed, promises shifted. Rival courts used him and rejected him, and his army entered Italy. Honorius remained behind the marshes and defences of Ravenna, a capital chosen partly because it was difficult to attack, while the old city of Rome, still rich in symbolic meaning, became exposed in 410 after sieges and desperate bargaining. Alaric's forces entered and sacked Rome. The physical destruction was limited compared with later imagination. Churches offered refuge, and the occupation lasted only days. Yet the emotional shock crossed the Mediterranean. Rome had not been captured by a foreign enemy for many centuries. Writers struggled to explain how the city associated with world rule could be humiliated. Pagans blamed abandonment of traditional gods. Christians argued that earthly cities were always temporary. Refugees carried stories into Africa and the East, and aristocratic families discovered that ancient prestige offered no guarantee of safety. The sack mattered because it made visible what frontier losses had already shown. The Western government could no longer protect its most famous city while defending the wider territory. Choosing Ravenna preserved the emperor, but preserving the emperor was not the same as preserving the empire at nearly the same time. The Rhine frontier broke under severe pressure. On the final night of 406, according to traditional dating, groups identified as Vandals, Alans, and Sueves crossed into Gaul. Whether the river was frozen or crossed by other means is uncertain, but the strategic effect was clear. Roman control in the region had been weakened by civil conflict and troop movements. Invaders and migrants spread through provinces already caught between local usurpers and imperial forces. Towns defended themselves, landowners negotiated, armies shifted allegiance, and authority fragmented. Some groups moved into Spain, where they fought one another, faced Roman and Federate forces, and established regional control. Britain, distant across the Channel, slipped from direct imperial government. Troops proclaimed their own emperors. One claimant crossed into Gaul, and the central government, unable to restore regular defense, effectively left local communities to arrange their future. Later tradition remembered a Roman withdrawal as though a single order ended centuries of rule. But the change was more uneven. Military pay ceased. Administrators lost support. Towns adapted. Local leaders gained influence. Trade patterns altered. And the island's connection to continental government weakened. Britain had once demonstrated the reach of Roman ambition. Now it demonstrated the cost of holding a remote province when crises closer to Italy demanded every available soldier. The Western Empire responded by using Federate groups against other Federates and invaders. Goths were settled in southwestern Gaul. Burgundians established themselves in another region. Franks gained influence near the Rhine, and local rulers accepted imperial titles while building power on the ground. These arrangements are sometimes described as the empire handing away its territory, but the reality was more gradual. the Western government often lacked the force to expel newcomers, so it converted necessity into law. Grants of land, tax shares, military commands, and official recognition transformed enemies into nominal allies. In theory, they defended Roman provinces in the emperor's name. In practice, their kings and leaders developed hereditary authority. The imperial map remained on documents longer than imperial taxation, and command remained effective. This was another consequence of size. The center could claim a province without reaching it, issue laws without enforcing them, and appoint officials whose power depended on local armies not under full central control. Sovereignty became layered. A city might obey its bishop, bargain with a nearby king, remember Roman law, use imperial titles, and send no meaningful revenue to Ravenna. The loss of North Africa was especially damaging. The Vandals and Alans, under their king Gaiseric, crossed from Spain into Africa in 429, moving through provinces that included some of the wealthiest agricultural lands of the Western Empire. Internal Roman conflict helped open the way. Competing officials sought military advantage, and the central government struggled to respond after years of war and negotiation. The Vandals captured Carthage in 439, gaining a major port, shipyards, rich estate, and control over sea routes. Africa had supplied grain and tax revenue, supported aristocratic wealth, and helped finance Western armies. Unlike losses in distant Britain, the loss of Carthage struck directly at the fiscal heart of the Western state. Without African revenue, emperors had less money to recruit soldiers, maintain fleets, reward allies, and recover other provinces. Efforts to reconquer the region required enormous naval expeditions, which were expensive and risky. Failure consumed resources that could not easily be replaced. The Vandals developed a strong maritime kingdom and raided across the western Mediterranean, showing that the sea, once treated as Rome's secure inner highway, could become a route for enemies. The empire's geographic unity had always depended on control of water. Once that control fractured, Italy, Gaul, Spain, and Africa became harder to support as one system. The arrival of the Huns under Attila added another powerful force to the already unstable balance. Hunnic leaders built an empire beyond the Danube through warfare, tribute, alliance, and control over subject peoples. Eastern emperors paid large sums to avoid attack or secure peace, fortified Constantinople and reorganized defenses, and despite destructive invasions, the East retained enough revenue and strategic depth to survive. Attila later turned west, where Roman general Aetius assembled a coalition that included Roman troops and Federate forces, among them Visigoths, to oppose him in Gaul. The battle, commonly called the Catalaunian Plains in 451, checked the advance, though it did not destroy Hunnic power. The following year, Attila entered Italy. Cities suffered, populations fled, and negotiations, supply problems, disease, and eastern pressure may all have contributed to his withdrawal. The Western Empire could still organize resistance, but only through coalitions whose members had separate interests. Aetius was called the last of the Romans by later tradition, yet his career also shows why individual strength threatened imperial politics. Emperor Valentinian III personally killed him, fearing his power, and was himself assassinated soon afterward, once again. The state destroyed a commander it needed because it lacked institutions strong enough to contain him. The old contradiction of imperial scale remained. Rome required regional military leaders with freedom to act, but every such leader could become more powerful than the court in 455. Gaiseric's Vandals sailed to Italy and entered Rome. The city was plundered over a longer period than in Alaric's sack. Wealth, captives, and sacred objects were carried away. The Western throne then passed through a rapid sequence of emperors, many controlled by generals of Germanic or provincial background. Ricimer became one of the most influential kingmakers, raising and removing rulers while avoiding the imperial title himself. These shadowed reigns are sometimes treated as mere farce, but each reflected real political limits. An emperor without an army depended on the general who possessed one. A general without dynastic legitimacy used an emperor to issue laws and negotiate. The arrangement preserved Roman forms while hollowing out central independence. Regions acted more freely, tax income shrank, and the Western court struggled to pay even the forces near Italy. Eastern emperors occasionally supported Western candidates and launched major recovery efforts, but their priorities included Persia, the Balkans, internal religious disputes, and the defense of Constantinople. Helping the West was costly, and failed intervention could threaten Eastern stability. The enormous expedition against Vandal Africa in 468 became one of the clearest examples. Eastern and Western resources were assembled for a naval campaign intended to recover Carthage. Fleets carried soldiers and supplies on a scale that demonstrated the continuing capacity of the Roman state. But poor coordination, hesitation, and Vandal fireships brought disaster. The loss emptied treasuries and ended the best chance to restore the Western fiscal base. After this, the Western government's remaining territory and authority contracted rapidly. Gaul contained competing Roman, Visigothic, Burgundian, and Frankish powers. Spain was divided among regional kingdoms. Africa was lost, Britain had long departed, and Italy itself depended on armies whose commanders demanded land for their men. Emperors still issued titles and coins, but the network that gave those symbols force had become too small. In 476, the commander Odoacer removed the young Western emperor Romulus Augustulus, sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, and ruled Italy as king while formally acknowledging the Eastern emperor. This date is often presented as the fall of the Roman Empire. Yet no crowd woke the next morning in a completely new world. The Senate continued. Administrators worked. Roman law remained. Taxes were collected, estates produced crops, churches held services, and many people experienced the change as another replacement at the top. An earlier Western emperor, Julius Nepos, still lived in Dalmatia and was recognized in some formal sense until his death. While Odoacer used Roman institutions rather than destroying them, the year 476 is useful because the separate Western imperial office was not restored. But the Western Empire had been dissolving for generations. Its final ruler did not lose a vast unified state. He lost a title whose practical territory had narrowed largely to Italy. The Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, continued, and its survival proves that size alone did not doom Rome. The East faced invasions, plague, civil war, religious conflict, and fiscal strain, yet it possessed a richer tax base, more defensible geography, stronger cities, a stable capital, and a government able to redirect or defeat threatening groups. Eastern emperors managed powerful generals more successfully at crucial moments, negotiated with foreign leaders, maintained gold currency, and preserved administrative continuity in the 6th century. Justinian would even reconquer North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. Though the cost of those wars and later epidemics showed again how difficult it was to rebuild Mediterranean unity, people in Constantinople did not call themselves Byzantines, they called themselves Romans. Their empire survived for almost another 1,000 years in changing form. The Roman state, therefore, did not vanish in the 5th century. Its western half lost the ability to coordinate resources across its territory, while the eastern half retained a core strong enough to continue. Looking back across the entire story, the phrase "too big to survive" should be understood carefully. Rome did not fall because its borders crossed a magical limit. Vast states can endure when administration, communication, revenue, legitimacy, and defense remain balanced. Rome itself endured at extraordinary scale for centuries. The problem was that conquest created permanent commitments without creating permanent growth. Every frontier required protection after the victory parade ended. Every province required cooperation after the governor arrived. Every road required repair after the legion marched. And every army required pay whether the harvest was generous or poor. During the early empire, expansion, tribute, Urban growth, local partnership, and Mediterranean security made these costs manageable. During later centuries, epidemic disease reduced populations. Civil wars consumed soldiers, monetary disruption weakened exchange, foreign powers became more organized, and political succession remained violent. Scale connected these pressures until each one worsened the others. A smaller state might abandon one frontier and protect its center. Rome's identity made abandonment politically difficult. Emperors claimed universal victory and inherited expectations built by centuries of conquest. Retreat damaged legitimacy, so rulers often fought to recover territories whose cost exceeded their revenue. A smaller state might rely on one regional army. Rome needed many, and many armies created rival emperors. A smaller state might know quickly when a governor rebelled. Rome waited for messengers crossing seas and mountains. A smaller state might adjust taxes to local conditions. Rome sought predictable quotas from radically different landscapes. A smaller state might integrate one migrating community gradually. Rome confronted several large movements while already divided. None of these comparisons means that small states are naturally safe. Only that Rome's particular form of greatness turned ordinary problems into continental ones. The empire also became too large for loyalty to remain simple. A soldier could be loyal to his commander, his unit, his region, his family, his faith, and the emperor. But those loyalties did not always point in the same direction. A provincial aristocrat could value Roman law while refusing taxes. A Gothic king could defend imperial territory while bargaining for independence. An Eastern court could speak of one empire while declining to rescue the West. A bishop could protect a Roman city by negotiating with a non-Roman ruler. The empire survived when these layered loyalties overlapped. It weakened when they separated by the 5th century. Many people still valued Roman order, but fewer believed that the Western imperial government could provide it. Local kingdoms did not replace Rome with an entirely alien civilization. They borrowed its law, language, titles, religion, taxation, and ceremonies. The Roman world fragmented into successor societies because Roman habits remained useful after Roman central power failed. There is a quiet irony in the roads that still cross Europe, the aqueducts that continue to stand, the city plans buried beneath modern streets, and the legal words that survive in later languages. Rome became too large to govern as one Western system, yet its scale allowed its influence to travel far beyond the life of that system. Soldiers carried Latin to distant forts. Merchants linked ports, engineers shaped landscapes, jurists developed principles, citizens moved across provinces, and Christianity spread through imperial networks. When political unity broke, cultural memory remained. Later rulers claimed Roman titles, churches preserved Roman learning, cities reused Roman walls, and communities measured decline against an ideal of peace that the empire itself had created now. As the imagined night settles again across the ancient provinces, the borders grow quiet on the map. The watchfires beside Hadrian's Wall fade into mist. Moonlight rests on the Rhine. The Danube passes ruined forts. Desert winds move through Syrian stones, and the waters around Constantinople reflect the lamps of a city that still calls itself Roman. Far to the west, Ravenna's mosaics shine above changing rulers. Rome's streets remain inhabited beneath churches and broken monuments. Carthage looks across a sea no longer commanded by one power, and villages from Britain to Africa continue their lives without knowing that later historians will place them inside an ending. The empire's disappearance was slow enough that many endings overlapped. An army left one province, a tax office closed in another, a king replaced a governor elsewhere, a city wall was repaired, a road became quieter, a coin stopped arriving, a bishop assumed a civic duty, a farmer paid rent to a new master, and a child grew up using Roman words in a world no longer ruled from Rome. The lesson is not that ambition must always fail, nor that diversity made unity impossible. Rome's long life was built precisely through ambition and diversity. The lesson is that power creates responsibilities as quickly as it creates glory. Territory is not controlled merely because it is colored on a map. It must be reached, supplied, defended, understood. And given reasons to cooperate, Rome mastered these tasks better than almost any ancient state. But success encouraged further expansion, and further expansion made every later shock more expensive. The empire could win battles and still lose capacity, rebuild walls and still lose revenue, appoint emperors and still lose trust, make laws and still lose local obedience by the time the Western imperial title disappeared. Rome had not been defeated by one enemy or one mistake. It had been worn down by the accumulating difficulty of making a vast, unequal, threatened, and politically divided world respond as a single body for centuries. That body had moved with astonishing strength. Grain ships crossed the sea. Couriers changed horses, magistrates opened courts. Soldiers answered trumpets, builders raised arches, and provincial families imagined futures within Roman order. Then the rhythm became uneven. Some roads remained busy while others emptied. Some cities flourished while others contracted. The East gathered strength while the West surrendered distance. What became too large to survive was not Roman civilization itself, and not even the Roman imperial idea, but a particular Western network of armies, taxes, offices, and agreements whose parts could no longer support one another. Its fall was therefore both dramatic and ordinary. Dramatic in battles, sacks, assassinations, and migrations, ordinary in delayed messages, unpaid wages, neglected repairs, abandoned fields, disputed invoices, missing recruits, and local bargains made because distant authority did not arrive as sleep approaches. The Roman Empire can be left not at the instant of destruction, but in a long twilight, its monuments still standing, its people still speaking, its laws still remembered, its frontiers becoming landscapes rather than lines. The immense structure has not vanished. It has softened into kingdoms, churches, languages, roads, ruins, and stories. The empire became too big to survive in the West because it could no longer bring its resources to the places that needed them, no longer choose rulers without weakening itself, no longer defend every frontier without stripping another, and no longer ask more from its provinces without reducing their ability to give. Yet the memory of unity outlived the machinery that created it, lingering over Europe, North Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean like the final warmth of stone after sunset. A reminder that the greatest empires are held together not by size alone, but by countless fragile connections, and when those connections loosen, even a world that once seemed eternal can quietly become history.